click on the agenda since I don't have it otherwise on my screen. But I'll call the meeting. Oh, yeah, got it. So let's call the meeting to order. And Jordan, would you be kind enough to call the roll?
With us today, we have Roger Kirschner, Lisa Selman, Gary Hollins, Alana Wilson. And from the staff, we have Jordan Cooper, myself, Alexander Martin, and Noberto Delgadillo.
Okay, and let's hope that others will join us as we keep rolling along. The first item on our agenda is, are there any questions or follow-up that members would like to ask based on the board's work sessions? And Jordan has been kind enough to list the links to each of those work sessions on the agenda if you want to reference them if you ask a question. And Jordan, I think since I'm looking at the agenda, I can't see whether anybody's raised their hand. So would you just accommodate us and let me know if someone has a question to ask?
Yeah, of course. And it looks like a couple of folks just got into the agenda, so we might want to give them just a couple minutes to look it over. And
Hi, this is Ilana. I was curious to know how other folks are feeling that work session with the board went, and if you feel like it was productive, led to any potential changes that folks are hoping for. Yeah, just curious how other folks are feeling about it.
I guess I kind of walked away. I know Jordan sent a note maybe afterwards of whether there was other questions, and it didn't seem like there was a lot of back and forth between the two groups. It more seemed like it was the board processing some of the information too and talking through the methodology and how things will be applied. So I don't know if that's kind of what you're asking, Alana, as far as was it helpful or I mean, it's always good to listen to conversation and hear what's rising to the top as far as priorities and concerns. And so that's kind of just my take.
It's my observation that we have new members on the board, and that our work session exhibits that there's a lot that to be learned, I guess, and about the budgeting process, and that ongoing concerns that they bring to the board. And it's been my experience in the years that I have been on CBRC that even CBRC members come with particular objectives in mind, and then as they go about learning more about it, they learn either how to best pursue those objectives or to modify them so they can be worked into the budget process. And I think it's my observation that COVID has not done any favors to our work or the board's work, for example. In a normal year, CBRC gets underway normally in September or October and drills down on certain subject areas that are of concern in every budget year, like SPED funding, ELL funding, and so on, and individual staffing of schools, and on it goes. Also, there's board members will learn that over time that yes, they are involved in the budget process by the policies they adopt throughout the year. They're engaged in budgeting, whether they recognize it or not, because whatever policies they adopt are instructions literally to the superintendent to incorporate into the proposed budget. And so we'll jointly be on the lookout to see what those are when the budget is presented later in April. So I was I took note of some of the concerns that were raised by in our joint session, but I too felt that it kind of lacked in its robust discussion of anything. Anybody else want to share?
I'll chime in real quickly, kind of as a staff, kind of experiencing my first full cycle. And I do wonder if there was a missed opportunity when we had our prior board work session where so I think it was I don't know if it was 3 weeks in a row or 2 weeks in a row where we had more in-depth conversations. So I'm making a note, and Jordan and I spoke about this as well, of a missed opportunity to have had CBRC as like why couldn't it have been 2 work sessions, or at least had 2 joint work sessions with CBRC as part of the conversation? So that's just, I think, a learning I'm taking as we continue these process, and budget development being an iterative process. How do we leverage these opportunities? So that CBRC as an extension of the board is also part of those other work sessions.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Alberto. I think you're spot on. I'd have to say at times it seems like CBRC is more of an afterthought and a unnecessary nuisance in the eyes of the board, we're not always thought of as an integral part of the budgetary process, and yet by statute and by adopted policy we are, and yet it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that has been said, and would like to note that community engagement and having meaningful engagement from community in budgets specifically is something that does not necessarily make it efficient or easier to create a budget, but it will be a budget that Portland can be proud of. And so I would like us to definitely continue. I believe that debrief is integral to growth. And so I appreciate you already thinking through some possible takeaways for next year in Alberto as we think through how to ensure that this space is a group that can meaningfully engage within the budget process and within the final result.
Thank you. And I'll share that we're also having conversations to get out ahead and extend the reach and and increase CBRC membership as well. So is kind of first full cycle scene, and so we're having conversations with Shanice and her communications department, some of her team. So what does earlier engagement and leveraging existing CBRC members and other channels to increase our community engagement and input, both formally in CBRC and informally through other channels. So it's definitely something that we're working through and thinking of ways to improve.
Are there any other questions that, before we move on to the next item on the agenda?
I have a couple things when my computer's been acting up.
I can't really hear you, Gary, if you've amped up or whatever is necessary.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay. So let me see if I can put on a microphone or something.
I think it's also lagging, Dr. Hollins. Like so that may be part of it.
Okay, let me see.
It's moving in slow motion.
Can you hear me a little better now?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for the lag. I got to get a different connection here at the house. So this is my first cycle with the CBRC as well. But I guess for me also, I'm having a hard understanding of the connection of the work that's supposed to be done here and how that connects to the overall budget. And I think for me, it would be nice to see how this is supposed to work. Because I'm not really, this is just my own opinion, I'm not really seeing a connection between the work we do here and how that affects the recommendation that goes to the superintendent that ultimately comes to the full board.
I think the connection is frozen. Director Hans, is that happening with everyone else?
Yes. Yeah. Although I think I got
Did you guys get that?
I'll give it a shot. I think I did hear, and so I think that's the opportunity for us to be able to recenter on that expectation. I know from a the clearest expectation between CBRC and the board, with my recent experience, has been closer to the levy and the local option levy, and kind of like the direct connection to providing information and oversight to that. But I do turn to Roger and a few other folks who've had additional cycles and maybe have seen different variations or iterations of CBRC over the years to give some input as to how do we build on this for the upcoming year, and also just reinforcing those conversations with future CBRC members, and also circling back with the rest of the Board of Education as far as managing those expectations between both entities. I'm definitely all ears and open to suggestions and other ideas.
Well, let me chime in. I'm sorry, who wants to go ahead and speak?
I'll let you go first, Roger, because you have more experience than me, and then I'll fill it. I'll add my 2 cents at the end.
Okay. Initially, when I came on CBRC, its primary function was to review and comment on the proposed budget of the superintendent. And added was the responsibility to ensure that local option levy funds were being utilized as promised on the ballot that was submitted to the voters. Initially, that was very difficult. Reporting on LOAC, the local option levy, was difficult because the district at that time did not have a mechanism where it could call out the local option levy funds and to demonstrate that they were indeed being utilized for teacher salaries or to support teachers. And so back when David Wine, a former board member, was then the budget director, side account was created, and I don't know what the district uses nowadays, but I presume it's something similar that isolates those funds so we know quite readily how the funds have been used. And in recent years, in the most recent submittal to the ballot, it was expanded. The funds are used for teacher salaries and or support staff, and like paras and so on. So I'm looking forward to reviewing the data once it's submitted to us. In years past, the review of LOLC, the funds has been fairly quick, whereas the review of the budget itself was a much more arduous task. And as I referenced earlier, CBRC used to be starting to review various elements of the that appear in the budget annually, starting early in the fall. So our expertise was more refined when it came to actually reviewing the proposed budget. And it's been an ongoing debate as to what our role should be after a budget gets adopted and is later amended, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think for maybe Jordan and Alberto, maybe before the next meeting we can share, because I think for Gary and some of the new members, it might be helpful to see the letter that was submitted last year from the CBRC to kind of, and I think actually in preparing for our letter this year, it might be good that people see what some of the comments were, and we can start thinking about what are some of the issues that we see as a group. I think it might be really helpful because then Gary can see how that feeds into, formally how we submit our comments and being part of the conversation there. I do think, as we talked about the last session with the board, of trying to figure out other ways to be more engaged with the two groups instead of just being listeners in the process. But yeah, I think that for me, like based on what Gary was asking, that seems like it would be very helpful for the new members to see that communication.
I think Jordan should be able to access that for us quite quickly, but just as an observation, when the proposed budget is submitted, it's always in the first 20 pages or so the comments that were submitted on the previous budget. So it'll also be there. So
Yeah, I will say that the the letter submitted last year is in the Google shared drive as well, the CBRC shared drive, and I just highlighted this, Lisa. I'll make sure that we just include a copy of that in the next meeting's agenda, just so folks have it. I'll also send it out via email because I think you're right. That's a good idea. But if you're wanting to look backwards at previous years, at least the last couple of years, all those documents are in the shared drive. And just let me know if you need access or anything specifically. Happy to help.
well, all these have been good comments, I think. And Gary, did you have any further thing that you wanted to share?
Nope, I'm good.
It's Ailey here. I wanted to apologize for being late. I have a meeting, CRBC I can be at from 5 to 6, and Southeast Guiding Coalition I have to be at from 6 to 7. And somehow in my brain, I decided CBRC was 6 to 7 and Southeast Guiding Coalition was 7 to 8. So Jordan, I saw Jordan's email. I'm like, oh, I'm late. So I apologize.
Ailey, Director Lowry, I just put in the chat the agenda and staff presentation links for today. And thank you for being here.
So if we have asked our questions, we'd probably best move on to the next item, which is the local option levy information, which is a staff presentation that Berto is prepared to give us.
And Roger, right before we do that, earlier we missed the review and adopt meeting notes from last meeting.
Oh, yeah. So I need a motion. Ilana, don't be bashful.
I was trying to figure out if they're notes from our work session or from our last meeting.
Oh, those are notes from our last meeting, which was early in the month. I think like the 3rd.
Okay. Great. And I will move. I move to approve those minutes from earlier.
Is there a second?
I can second, Lisa.
Okay. Ilana has moved and seconded by Lisa. All those approving say aye. Aye. Anybody else?
Alana's got an eye, Lisa.
Oh, yeah, I waved my hand, but I
say okay. I'm not on that screen. I'm afraid to eliminate this screen and I'll lose you all. So So, okay, well, let's move ahead then. The minutes stand approved as read or written, and thank you, Alexandra, for presume you were the scrivener. And so, Berto, if you would move ahead with your presentation about the local option levy.
Sure thing. Well, we were just talking about the local option levy. So for today, I want to share a primer on what is a local option levy and how does it impact us, and really being able to share it in anticipation of the upcoming reports we'll share and conversation we'll have in over the next remaining sessions where the CBRC will approve local option levy usage. but also sharing it, from the perspective of the public, as just kind of being able for the general public to get a better understanding around the local option levy. And so I'm going to share my screen. Or maybe it's you, Jordan.
I have it up right now. I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, it's been disabled. I cannot do it.
I was prepared.
Thank you. So yeah, let's kick it off. And I think two key things with the presentation is around how it benefits us, and then also the role CBRC plays. So we move on to the next slide. It's important to note that of all the funds, so if y'all remember, there's like 5 key funds that make our entire budget. The local option levy resides in the general fund. So it's a component of the general fund, and that the general fund is a portion of our budget that gives us the most flexibility. And if we go to the next slide, so if we double click on that blue part of the pie, we then see the various funding sources that make up the general fund. And so for this current year, the local option levy, and for most part, it tends to hold steady at about 13 or 14% of the general fund. So when we take a look at our entire budget of, our entire general fund budget, so that big blue slice that if you double click on it, you see the various funding sources that make up the general fund. That's about $770 million. It's a general fund. And the local option levy is about $105 million out of that general fund. If we go on to the next slide, just a little bit of historical information that the current local option levy was approved by voters. So this is something that goes to our community and they vote on it. And it was approved for 5 years. And the funding is strictly for teaching positions and classroom supports. And back in November 2019, voters renewed it for another 5 years. So it'll be coming back up for vote in 2024. And one key component, a critical component of the local option levy, is that the state school fund formula excludes the local option levy in its calculations. Therefore, the local option levy is in addition to the state school fund grant. And the nuance there is that most local property taxes, local revenue, get accounted for at the state level, and there is this balancing that happens between those resources. But at the end of the day, with the local option levy, these are dollars on top of the state school fund grant. So it's a good thing. It definitely helps improve and enhances our budget. If we go on to the next slide, it's a little bit of like the mechanics around the math. And so the levy maintains an existing tax rate of $1.99 per $1,000 of assessed value. So what does that mean? So in a practical example, for a home with an assessed value of $250,000, the cost would be about $498 per year. 2 things to point out here. One thing is it's based on the assessed value of the home, not the real market value. So not what Zillow is calling out when you take a look and you're like, wow, that's amazing, 15% year to year over growth. That's not the case. It's the assessed value. So there's some specific rules that manage that. And so if you have an assessed value of $250,000, you divide that by $1,000. So how many $1,000 increments fit in $250,000? That answer you multiply by $1.99, and that essentially gives you the tax rate that the local option levy collects. And earlier in our conversation, Roger was talking about the site account, and what it really is to improve transparency and clarity around how these funds are collected. The levy funds are placed in a sub-account within the general fund, so they're kept separate. So as the year progresses, we can clearly see and delineate, wow, $100 million was collected out of the levy funds. They're being kept in this separate sub-account. And so now we're going to apply that to pay for teachers. And I'll give an example in a minute. If we go on to the next slide. So towards the end of the school year, total levy funds are calculated, and then based on the average teacher compensation, so their benefits and salaries, the number of teachers paid are determined. So if $104 million is collected, and the average teacher salary and benefits, it's $117,000, then you divide that into 104 million, and you determine that, okay, the levy will pay for 889 teachers. Last year, the local option levy funded approximately 884 teaching positions. If we go on to the next slide, and one of the key components of the ballot initiative was that the local option levy required independent citizen oversight. So the tax dollars are used for its intended purposes. And so the Community Budget Review Committee, as appointed by the board, serves as this oversight body. So before the CBRC meeting cycle's over, so we know we have a few meetings left, staff's going to provide the committee with a handful of reports that will include the levies collected, what is the average salaries, and then be able to show the impact that this funding has had, and the ability to pay for these teachers. On the next slide, essentially to conclude the presentation, I didn't want to add too much math into this, just some two key examples. And fundamentally, when we think about the role that CBRC plays, they're the oversight body of the local option levy. The local option levy is calculated on assessed property value, so it's not dependent on enrollment. And it's separate from the state school fund grant. So this is in addition to the state fund grant. There's this other revenue source, the local option levy, which we are grateful that our community has voted for 2 consecutive cycles. And that approximate $100 million in local option levy pays for about 1/3 of our classroom teachers. And so you can imagine it's a critical funding source for us. So that's the end of the presentation. You go on to the next slide and really open it up for additional questions and discussions, and just see if there's something else we can subsequently share as we continue this component of the conversation with the local option levy.
So, are there any questions?
Hobbs, are you raising your hand? Or you're on mute?
Sorry about that. I came in late, but so I just wanted to clarify some things. So what I'm understanding here, the option levy is a form of funding that like the community can opt in to or opt for, and this is like a pool of funding that is derived from property tax, and then there's a specific calculation based off of assessed value for each property, and then this funding is to supplement like teacher salaries. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in summary, I think the clearer way is saying it pays for teacher salaries, and allows for us to have $100 million more worth of critical teachers in the classroom. And yes, it's based on assessed value, and it's voter approved. So the community, this goes out to as a ballot measure, and community votes on it.
Mm-hmm. So I think you answered my question, but the option levy tax is not used to supplement any other thing in any other budget item.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, we can't use it for administrative purposes, and that's part of the rationale that it's set aside in a separate sub account. So that way, it's clearly calculated and then applied towards teacher salaries and benefits.
Got it. From what I just said, did I miss anything, like crucial things?
No, I don't think so.
I think you have the concept in a nutshell there. The local option levy runs for 5 years, or it's voter approval, and what I think it's good to think of it as a dedicated fund, and it can be only utilized for teacher salaries, as is promised to the voters when they vote for the ballot measure, and that's why citizen CBRC is tasked with reviewing that indeed the district is faithful and complying with the voters' wishes, and that's what we do on an annual basis. The last time it was renewed was actually a year before the 5th year, because the market was it was a robust time to go to the market at that time, and so we renewed the levy before the previous one had expired. So I don't know whether that's a prospect or not, but we don't have too much more time. One observation I will make was the last time as we neared the deadline for the ballot measure, I had to point it out to a board member because they didn't realize that, and so they were then having to deal with that decision.
So what you're telling me is that it has been, or we've had this funding for 10 consecutive years, going on 15.
Yeah, I noticed Bearville referred to 2 times, but I think it's actually been more than that. But it's been at least for 10 years, or that.
Yeah, I had pulled since 2014, and then it went 5 years, and it came back to the voters in 2019, and then so thinking about your comments, Roger, and just being able to give ourselves the appropriate runway to plan accordingly. So I think that'll be important and critical as we think about the conversations to have over the next year. And I know it's only 2022, but before you know it, 2024 is going to be knocking on our door, and so we want to be ready for that.
There are other considerations that go into, for example, if the district is going out with a bond measure for modernizing schools, do you want both things to be on the ballot at the same time or whatever, those kinds of things that become a consideration for the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are definitely real considerations, and having experienced it in other places where board sentiment, community sentiment, to just kind of get a sense of adding multiple initiatives on a ballot, and those conversations to be had. But yeah, it's local option levy is 800, 900 teachers. It's a really critical key funding stream.
I've forgotten what the state statute, how it reads, whether that's a local option levies or an an option for all the school districts or whether it's just confined to a few. I know there are only a few districts that have them, so and Portland Public is one of them.
I don't know. I don't know off the top of my head how that statute reads. I would need to go back and do a little research on that. And Hobbs, as I was also reflecting on your question as far as critical points, I think the only other one, and Roger touched on it, so just reaffirming, is the role that CBRC plays and as the oversight committee in validating the usage of those funds.
Yeah, my point was that in one of the early iterations, the campaign literature promised certain things, and then we found that we were really strapped in being able to isolate the data to prove that we were expending the money as promised, and that was why the site account or sub account or whatever it's called was created to make that clearer and easier to track. Do we have some more questions?
I have a couple questions. Can everybody hear me better now?
Yes.
Much better.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm looking at, I got a couple questions because it's just for clarity for me. So when I look at the general fund or the total revenue breakdown and where the option levy resides at as far as the general funds, so this is around going by you, and I love the charts. This is definitely a lot simpler to understand. So I'm looking like we're at around 14% of our general fund revenues is coming through the option levy. Question one is, if the levy does not get renewed, what kind of impact would that have on the teachers that comes out of those funds?
That would subsequently be, I think it'd be less, obviously it funds teachers directly, but it would just have to be a broader conversation of trade-offs. There's $100 million less in the budget. So what are then the different levers that need to be pulled to try to make up that difference? Or whether it's additional state funding, whether it's cutting costs to make up the difference, repurposing. So it would be a full-on broader conversation, and that's part of thinking about how do we set the run ramp or set up the on ramp for conversations, getting out to voters sooner, just kind of being able to have certainty and give us enough time. If for some unforeseen reason it happened to be a no, then we give ourselves enough time to have thoughtful conversations of what it looks like for our budget to have $100 million less.
Okay, and so second question is, I know with option levies, there's caps that can be on levies that are placed. Are we at the higher end of the cap for our levy, or where are we at on the level as far as what we can ask for instance, like the next levy? Are we on the low end, high end, in the middle?
I don't know, but that's a great question. I know there are, to your point, caps towards how much you can borrow against your overall assessed value. So whether it's you have so much assessed value, a portion's going to local option levy, a portion's going to your GO bonds, there's another portion going to something else. I would need to get back that and say, is this just a tenth or medium or kind of like being able to get to that? So I don't know off the top of my head.
That's a real puzzle, Gary, that you just hit on, and you're talking about compression rates, and for example, the voters in Multnomah County have been very, very generous in approving lots of levies, and but oftentimes they're unable to actually tax for the full amount that is approved because of the compression rate and so on, and not all households pay equally, unfortunately, and that has a long statutory history and how that's happened. But it goes back initially when ballot measure 5 was enacted, and then 41 or 42, I've forgotten what the number was, that followed up that tried to correct it. But there's a differential. You can have a neighbor that's lived there for a long time that's paying a lower rate than you are as a fairly newcomer to your neighborhood. So,
which plays into then like the other, in our budget book, we have another revenue line item that's the gap, like the gap tax to account for that measure 5 and all of those dynamics, and then thinking about how does then the local option levy play against the overall assessed value. I will do some research. Another question that comes off the top of my head is at what point do we decide on a $1.99 per 1,000? I'm sure there were some back end calculations that led to making that determination. I'll do a little bit of digging.
And also, when we looking at the levy piece, are we, and you might have answered and I didn't catch it, but when we're looking at the option levy, do we have to take in consideration other levies that's on the ballot as well, and or levies that fall off? Is that taken into consideration as well?
Two things come to mind. One is from a ballot initiative, I think would just depend on community sentiment as far as being able to put another initiative or whether it's a bond on top of a local option levy. I think that would be something to explore and get additional research. I don't have like a straight answer on that. But as far as being able to add additional levies or account for how much more can be added to because another levy fell off or another, it could be a bond. I think that gets back to the broader assessed value, how much borrowing capacity exists in our market, coupled with what are the ballot and commitments made to the community in maintaining taxes level or property taxes level, because you could borrow more, but then property taxes could end up going higher. But if there was a commitment to keep them flat or consistent, that could play against that. So I think there would be a few variables there in determining how much more can be borrowed, depending on what's been committed, depending on the overall assessed value of the market, that would then allow us whether or not to borrow more or less. Unfortunately, it's not a clear or short answer, but it's definitely a lot of variables that we would need to take into consideration.
Gary, back when we went to the ballot to renew the local option levy, at that time, one of the co-chairs of CBRC was the tax authority for the city of Portland, Thomas Latham, I think is his name. And he was advocating that we actually go for a larger amount per 1,000 than the 199. And it was the political decision made by the board that we could go to the voters saying, we're seeking renewal and we're not raising the rate and maintaining the 199. And so that's a history in a nutshell on our. We do have some, or at least at that time, we had some expanded capacity but whether to use it or not it was the question. And as I think that particular ballot, where taxpayers in the Multnomah County area, which Portland Public Schools resides as a portion of it, were confronting like something like 12 measures or so on. And so there were lots of reasons to be cautious as to how you presented what your needs were. And then as our previous discussion is that if the school district is going out for construction bonds on modernizing schools, the question becomes, do you want to be renewing a levy at the same time you're asking voters to approve $1 billion measure for something else? So. Any other questions? Fire away here. We got Berto in the hot seat.
You might have answered it, but do we compete with other jurisdictions when it comes to the tax levy piece as well?
I don't know if we compete. Well, it's so you could have other agencies who have taxing levying authority, and when you look at your property tax bill, you can see this district, this authority, and so
That's actually what I'm looking at right now. That's what I'm asking.
yeah. So yeah. So I always feel, I don't want to say we're competing against others, but at the end of the day, we're working to get our taxpayers to support, right, our initiatives, whether it's housing development or whether it's supporting teachers. It could be a variety of different aspects. So one way or the other, there is for a taxpayer the opportunity to make these decisions around like what initiatives do I continue to support.
I guess what I mean by competition, I guess as I'm looking at my tax bill now, and I'm seeing the list of taxes and levies and bonds that's on on the tax bill and you guys might have answered when we talked about compression. So for instance, if I look at, Portland Public Schools has a local option levy, and then the library has a levy, the Park Borough has a levy. If all those levies are going, if they all get approved, can one reduce the other one?
Um, no,
I think these are the questions, Gary, we ask of our political consultants when the board is making the political decisions. Like, this is not so much the budget people side of it, but Jeremy Wright was our consultant, I think, for the bond, but we had a consultant for the levy that helped us think through, and we did polling to see what was the appetite for voters to support and how much did we think would be politically acceptable. And I know that the board made the decision not to go after so much in the levy because we knew we were asking for a really big bond. And so we wanted to just renew the levy at the same level so that the bond would be not feel so like we're asking for more and more every time.
Well, yeah, no, I'm not, I get that. I'm not talking about that. I guess what I'm asking is there a limit? And I guess we may just go back to the compression. Is there a limit to say if we have 5 bonds on the ballot and you say we're capped at, I don't know, say 10% of your assessed value?
Yeah, I was just about. So each entity is capped.
Okay,
so,
that's what I'm asking.
yeah. So then it's like, hey, PPS, you got up to 10% out of $300 billion, or whatever the case might be. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. So then we then go ahead and manage that
within that cap.
Within our cap, yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. Okay.
Yeah. Other questions?
Sorry, I wasn't completely following earlier when you said this, but when you were like talking about like tax compressions and like in back there, we were talking about like borrowing. Were you talking about like leveraging the assessed value to get more money? Was that what was being said? I just need a yes or no.
It's a way of saying I would just replace the word borrowing with taxing.
Okay.
It's a fundamental opportunity to look at the pool of available funding that's determined on the taxes that that's determined on how much you can tax on the assessed value.
Oh, okay. So okay. So this is like because like each entity, like library, fire department, right? They have their property tax, and then
Yep.
so okay. So I get it. The voters opt in.
Yeah. At the end of the day, voters opt in.
Addition.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind. Okay. Clarified. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just reading a summary of how measure 5 compresses, and kind of to Gary's question that the limits are $5 per 1,000 real market value for school taxes and $10 per 1,000 real market value for general government taxes. These limits are applied only to operating taxes, not bonds. For each property, the assessor compares education taxes with the education limit and other government taxes with the general government limit. If property taxes exceed the Measure 5 limits, then taxes are compressed in a specific order. First, local option taxes are reduced, possibly to zero. If there are no local option taxes or they have been reduced to zero, the tax rates from the permanent tax rates for each taxing district are reduced proportionately. So that just kind of, I guess that gives us an idea of what the pecking order is of what gets reduced first. It sounds like the education taxes are first.
And the greatest ramification of ballot measure 5, of course, was it eliminated local property taxes supporting local school districts and thrust the responsibility of funding schools to the state. That's why we have an allocation that comes from the state nowadays that fund our except for the funds that we raise by local option. And and the promoters of ballot measure 5 promised that it would not affect education at all, and of course it did. And we went through years and years and years where we were cutting. So anyway, I think our compression is a very difficult subject to understand, and I can tell you that I've been on this committee several years, and it's always helpful to have it re-explained year after year. Do we have other questions? Observations? That was very helpful, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm sending, Jordan was just asking me the link for that, so I'll email you, Jordan, and then.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking maybe we could include that in the notes for people who are watching at home.
Yeah, that was very, very helpful. Thank you, guys.
So when we talk about, so in looking toward this year's or next year's budget and looking at that we're potentially losing teaching positions, and then we have priorities of where the district wants to focus on. For the local option levy positions, do they just get rolled up into total teaching positions, or is there a way that these positions that come from the local option levy can be applied toward priority areas versus just into the general pool of funding for teachers?
So it's what the local option levy dollars aren't like they don't follow a specific teacher. So it's that, and so from the assignment of the local option levy funds, that's why it happens kind of towards the end of the year, as the funding accumulates in this separate account. We then assess what's the average teacher salary compensation, and then make that general assignment based on total number of teachers in the system, and then apply the option levy against that. And one of the considerations is if I think it'll also be helpful to go and share it for maybe next meeting or over email. We can share the reports that were shared last year. I was reviewing them this morning for my further understanding is the local option levy is supposed to help across all the schools versus just like a specific targeted area, and that's attributed to the language in the ballot, and so or in the levy. And so then that's why we take the site account, we create the site account, collect all the revenue, and then based on the average teacher salary and compensation, then it's like, okay, that equates to $884, or excuse me, teaching positions. And so it's about a third. And then we generate a report that shows how the local option levy enhance teaching positions at every school.
Did that answer your question, Lisa?
Yeah, I think it's just that it just supplements, or it, you have a total need, and then the local option levy fills for a third of that, and then the rest is funding that comes from the remainder of the general fund, but that it's not tied to any specific program, school, or position, right? Is that, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So do we have any other questions to ask Berto? It's a complicated subject, and it's good for all of us to have a thorough understanding of what's involved.
Yeah, I would agree with Gary. I think what you just presented, Noberto, was very succinct and just kind of condensed it down into something that's very understandable. So thank you for that.
Happy to have done that.
Your presentation, Berto, reminds me that in previous years, after we've adopted the budget, the district that is, an executive summary that's only a few pages long, usually highly utilizing graphs like you just presented, help explain the general budget and the local option in lay terms, so it's easily digested. And it's my observation that most people tend to be interested as to what was allocated to my school, and how much staff, what's the dollar amounts, and so on and so on. So
thank you for that. Yeah, I have this wild dream to take our 500-page budget and have a one-pager So so it's like how would that look like? And yeah, using visuals. So it's I'm challenging myself and thinking about what the evolution of that could look like.
A common complaint is always about the size of the budget, not the dollar amount, but the volume. It's a big chunky document, and but as has been explained year after year after year, a lot of its format is dictated by state law. So,
Yep. State law, things that auditors require, GASB, accounting, general accounting principles, a variety of different things that dictate that. Yeah.
Will there be a budget narrative that's included? That's, it's not one page, but it's closer to 12, 10.
Yes. So that usually the first I don't know, dozen pages or so of the budget contains a narrative highlighting the key investments, highlighting the strategic focus. So yeah, that would be the case.
that's usually an iteration that the superintendent gives when he presents the budget. So do we have other questions, or should we move on to the next item on the agenda?
I do want to just, not to pull back to the beginning of the meeting, but just because Hobbs came in a little bit later, I just want to make sure we, just to make sure if you have any questions pertaining to the first part of the meeting, we talked about the 3:15 and 3:9 work sessions. I just wanted to see if you had any questions about those work sessions earlier in the month, or any follow-up or feedback. Yeah, just before we move on.
No. And I didn't really. I saw your email a month ago, Jordan. I didn't really talk just because I was sick. But I didn't have any questions. I understood everything that was happening, and for me, it was also kind of like it was being reiterated because it was some information that we had covered here at CBRC, but I was just confused that, like, and maybe this was because I had misunderstood what was happening, but that we didn't really get to talk about budgeting. But that was it.
And Hobbs, I'll add that ties into my comment earlier about the work session prior to that work session. We spent a lot more time looking at some of the numbers, and even I think 2 weeks or so prior to that as well. And they're getting into some of the budget focus areas that will then lead us to the subsequent superintendent's proposed budget at the end of April. So where we then have like the more refined numbers and a lot more of the data. But yeah, and so to say all that was, I think, opportunity for next time is when we have more in-depth budget work sessions, like how do we incorporate CBRC into that? Because the joint work session we had with CBRC and the board was almost like part 2 of this other conversation we had the week prior.
Are there going to be any future PPS board and CBRC work sessions?
So the next board, well, it's not a board meeting technically. It's going to be the presentation of the superintendent's budget. That's happening April 26th.
I think there's a couple other, not necessarily CBRC work sessions, but there's budget conversations coming up that are public I'm fairly certain. I'll look back at the invites that I received. But yeah, if there's anything that the board is talking about that's public, that's in regard to the budget, I will do my best to link those in an email and send it to you so you can watch.
And the important thing about board meetings is that they publish in their agenda times, and sometimes they're ahead of time and they move on to the next item, and sometimes they're woefully way behind. And so, you know, as it relates to CBRC, you know, we were last year tasked to present our report at 8:30, and that it turned out to be more like 10:30. So so anyway, I encourage any of you to follow board meetings just to keep informed. That's what I do, but I'm also retired, and so I'm probably better able to do that. So, and like yesterday, there were 2 subcommittee meetings, and I was at Blanchard from 1 o'clock till 6 o'clock, and the meeting was still going when I left. So let's move on then. If there's no further questions, and I don't have the agenda back up on my screen. I've got a nice picture of Jordan at the moment.
Isn't that what you were wanting? We the only other thing on the agenda is a wrap up, Roger.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, inform us. Our next meeting is next Thursday. Is that not correct?
Yes, that is correct. Next Thursday, I will send out a follow up on Monday with the links and everything. Yeah.
Which means I'll probably have the joy of talking to Jordan tomorrow to go over the agenda. So anyway, are there any particular items that committee members would like to see on the agenda for next meeting next week? Hobbs, I'm glad you joined us tonight, and I do remind you that our start time is at 5 o'clock on meeting dates, and I tend to be a stickler because of my military background that you start as close to me on time as possible. So.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just this went like completely over my head. I got too wrapped up in my college homework.
No problem. I'm not trying to admonish anybody. I just pointing out that what as Jordan knows, I tend to get started whether we're lacking a few members or not. So that's the reason why. So if there's no other good for the order of business, I thank you all for participating, and thank you, Bertha, for your presentation and for its clarity. And it's not an easy subject to digest, and each year I learn something new. So if there's nothing else, I'll give one more chance to anybody to say anything. Otherwise, we're adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.